Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Michael Nelson, how are you?
Doing great, Peter. How are you?
I don't know. Somehow it would surprise me if I said, "How you doing, Michael?" And you'd be like, "I'm not doing well today." Today's
I'm going to catch you one. I fill out my little mark bracket. How am I feeling today every day?
Yeah.
But I'm feeling pretty good today. So I'm
Okay.
going to say it to you.
All right, because you usually are. You're usually like, whenever I talk to you, you seem very happy. So that's it's a good thing. It's infectious. I'm not busting on you. I'm actually I need to take my kind pill. I'm just
Yeah. Well, I don't think people have tuned in just to hear you and I banter. We have two amazing guests that we're about to bring forward. Do you want to hear a little bit about it?
right through.
Yeah. Do you want to hear a little bit about it?
Yeah, of course.
All right, we have two people. We have Sonja Hollins-Alexander, who's an Associate Vice President, Content Advisor, and Scholar for Corwin, and Nicole Law, author, consultant, presents in the area of leadership, professional learning communities, culturally responsive pedagogy, educating multilingual learners, and multidimensional aspects for visible learning. They have just written a book together.
They have, and I gave you those bios because those are they're hard to articulate sometimes.
Did I do okay
You
or
did.
not?
You did really well. And contrary to what you said, I think people do want to listen to us banter every once in a while. I think our banter
Okay.
is pretty cool.
Well, how are you? How are you feeling today, Peter?
I'm feeling good because I'm co-hosting a podcast with Mike Nelson. Like, how could I be any other way? And honestly, no, in all seriousness, I agree. Like Sonja and Nicole, I've known for years. And they're too, I want to say wonderful, but that almost seems like it's too superlative. It just doesn't kind of connect. They're deeply thinking. They have a powerful impact when it comes to a lot of different topics. I enjoy time talking with them. And their new book is actually with Dominique Smith and John Hattie, and it's on mind frames for belonging, identities, and equity. And it's a really important book. And this was a great conversation that we had. So, what do you think you would like listeners to tune into when they listen to this podcast?
That's really great. Great question. And I think that here's what having this conversation reminded me of. I have a book that I could walk 3 steps and pick it up. It's a book that I purchased about 25 years ago by author Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. And it's called Hard Questions, Heart Answers.
Oh,
And throughout this podcast, I think you're going to hear a lot of heart because these two individuals that we're having the conversation with, they are passionate about their topic. They want cultural changes. They want us all to not only think, but rethink, learn, and unlearn. And so I think that's what I want our listeners to be thinking about.
I think that's perfect. So, happy listening. I think there's a lot of deep thinking that's going to be involved when you're listening to this podcast. So we really hope that you enjoy.
Are you a teacher looking for effective ways to improve student engagement? Corwin's Teacher Clarity Workshops go beyond traditional instruction and will help you create impactful learning experiences that invite students into their own development. Learn how at corwin.com.
Sonja Hollins-Alexander and Nicole Law, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us.
We are so excited for this conversation. We're going to have a lot of fun in the next 25 minutes or so, and we just can't wait to dive right in. So we are going to do that. Here's what struck me. First of all, I love the yellow background. I love the cover of the book. I can't wait to dive right into that. But there's something about yellow that pops happiness. It's a topic that we want to dive into, and good for you. And congratulations, many, many congratulations. We're recording this to our fans out there. We're recording this on the 1 month anniversary of the launch of this book, and congratulations again. Here's what I was most intrigued with. Let's get into the conversation. So what I was most intrigued with was there are 4 words that are always are always written when your book description, whether it's on Amazon or on Corwin website, and the words are learning is hard work. I love that it starts with that, and it made me think of, well, unlearning is hard, even harder work, and so this topic is so prevalent and so important to the learning process, the cultural changes that we want to have occur. So we just want to go right into what inspired you to write this book and what inspired you to work together to do this, because learning is hard and unlearning is hard, and we need both of them for this type of content, I think.
Great. Want me to go, Nicole, or would you like to go?
Absolutely. No, go ahead.
Yeah. So, which you probably are aware of, Nicole and I had an opportunity to come together as authors on our first publication that we co-authored together, which is Collective Equity. And collective equity was certainly a journey for us, but we see it as a foundational opportunity for us to be able to write. And we provided, I think, a lot of opportunities for educators to really understand the how when it comes to learning about equity, and that how is instrumental with the who. So we know that it takes a collective in order to do this hard work, Mike. But one of the things that Nicole and I always say when we do this work out in the field with educators, that not only is it hard work, but it's heart work. And so the two of those are extremely important. And when I think about Nicole and I coming together around collective equity, as well as the mind frames for belonging, identities, and equity, we're no strangers to hard work. Our backgrounds are very similar. We spent extensive time in the K-12 world, from teaching to being, a school social worker, being a building principal, district leader. And so we want to always be connected in that space with educators, because we know that this work is hard, but we also believe that in those spaces that we were in, we learned a lot. And it is our hope when the two of us come together that we can, harness that learning that we both experienced over the years of our career, and, write it and put it in a book and amplify our voices, so that when our, colleagues, educators out in the field are engaging in this hard work, they have the resources, the tools, and just, an opportunity to engage with us around, but how can this get done? Because the work of belonging, identities, and equity is not something that any of us can compromise on. We believe it is the work. It is the foundation to creating that right culture and climate in schools, so that not only our scholars, our students, our learners can, be the very best that they can be, but also the educators. So we came together around, I think, who we are, our values, and the work that we do as educators. And our hope when we come together is that we can provide a space and opportunity for others to learn and grow around the experiences that we've shared. So it's exciting because I care deeply for my co-author, not, just as a co-author, but as someone who I know has been out in the field and continues to work tirelessly in seeking to make a difference. And so it's real easy for us to do this work together because we are very similar in that way.
Thank you, Sonja. I love that. And Mike, as I, think about this work, and you talked about unlearning. And when I think about unlearning, which I absolutely love what we say in collective equity, that we have to update, unlearn, refine, and reconsider. And in order to really do this heart and hard work. And unlearning to me is the new learning. Is the new learning of this century to unlearn. And what we know is that we all have skills and knowledge when it comes to work around equity and belonging and identity. So I say equity first because we wrote the collective equity, but we know in the mind frames is BIE. But when we think about those skills and knowledge that we have to unlearn, in order to, when we unlearn, we also have to replace it with refinements and reconsiderations and that new learning. And we give educators an opportunity in both publications, but especially in mind frames for BIE, fortifying cultural bridges, the opportunity to really think about the mind frames that we have to embrace and what we know from Hattie and Zaire, that how we think about the impact of what we do is more important than what we do. And that quote to me is so profound. As we think about the impact of what we do is far more important than what we do. And so what are those mind frames as educators in all positions in schools that we have to unlearn in order to fully embrace those mind frames?
So I'd like to back up a little bit and ask some very practical questions. So two words that have come up, one is equity and one is unlearn. And what we try to do on the podcast is offer a shared understanding. So we know that we use a lot of common language, but we don't have a common understanding of those words. And when we hear words like equity, we know that it's been highly politicized and everything else. So, in your words, Nicole, and I'm going to start with you on this one, and then Sonja, maybe you can answer the one about unlearning. When you say equity, when you write about equity, when you're talking about impact where equity is concerned, what does equity mean?
Yeah, short and sweet. It means giving individuals, regardless of their dimensions of identity, what they need to thrive.
Mm.
Thrive in learning communities in terms of extracurricular, in terms of classroom instruction, in terms of being a part of that school culture. And I was just with a school team today from Iowa, and I thought about a goal. I've been thinking about a goal, an equity goal, if I were still in a school, if I were assistant superintendent or superintendent, that it would be short and sweet. It would be that every scholar has an opportunity to a rigorous, relevant, and relational experience within our school community. And then creating those measures to be able to say, all right, is it rigorous? And how do we know? Is it relevant to the needs of that individual? And how do we know? And then are we relational with these scholars, their families? And how do we know? And so that is definitely my definition of equity. Giving individuals what they need, scholars especially, to thrive within the learning community.
So I have one more question for you, Nicole, before I move on to Sonja with the unlearning question. Sorry. So why do you think that's so hard for people? Because I feel like we've been in a lot of conversations. Mike and I have had a lot of conversations. And when we're doing collaborative inquiry with school teams or leaders or whatever, tier one instruction comes up as one of the main goals for so many school leaders and teachers. And then we start talking about differentiated instruction. Once again, I think that's a word. I think that those are two words that people use all the time, but they don't know the meaning behind. Why do you think giving kids what they need is so difficult?
Well, one, I believe that we have created schools that are a one size fits all.
Mm.
And so that's why when we talk about differentiation and other kind of buzz terms, that it is really, difficult to think about equity, giving someone what they need in order to thrive. And when we think about what those needs might be, one, we might not be developed to provide those opportunities to target needs for one to thrive, and two, we might not have that mindset that that's needed. Oftentimes we hold mindsets that, in schools especially, that this is the way we do things in our schools, and there needs to be scholars that acquiesce.
Mhm,
That's hard for me to say.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you. And I wonder if that's also, Nicole, kind of leads into the second question that I wanted to ask Sanja, because when you're talking about that one size fits all and all of that stuff, Sanja, is that part of the unlearning that you're referring to? Because unlearning, the word has been around for a while, but what does
Mm.
unlearning actually mean? And is Nicole's example one example of unlearning?
Oh yeah. I'm sitting here smiling because Nicole and I can be in two different countries and our minds are always seem to be on one accord. So I love that about my co-author. And yes, when Nicole just shared, we might not have the mindset that is needed to provide the equitable learning opportunities. That is about when we don't and we become aware that we don't, how do we unlearn and disrupt those mental models? And so unlearning is, I think, first having personal consciousness and an awareness of what your mental models and your biases are, and not just knowing them, but when you are engaging with your colleagues and with others in a relational space, what are you doing to challenge those mindsets or that thinking in order for you to provide students with what they need in order to thrive? And then when you consider how you take that understanding into a professional, into a professional environment like a school, how do you come with other people? So I am walking through the framing of collective equity. Collective equity is about first recognizing what we need to unlearn because we are personally aware of what our biases and our mental models are, and then having a strong consideration for how we come into this world through our lived experiences, how that may be impacting the ways in which we support others to thrive, which is relational consciousness. And then in schools, we have to be very thoughtful about what we've been called to do, and that is to help these scholars to thrive around learning. So how are we professionally conscious around what we need to unlearn in order for them to get what they need? And also in our collective equity framework is that organizational consciousness. And how then are our ways of being where we continue to have these mental models that don't allow us to do what we need to do, thus requiring us to unlearn, how do they impact the overall culture and climate of what's happening in schools? And then finally, we all live within this big, society. So our students, our families, we all bring into these spaces of learning a lot of those biases and mental models that have to be disrupted and have to be unlearned. But what I really appreciate, in addition to Nicole sharing about mindsets, is when we unlearn, we have to have the resources and the tools to replace them with. And that's why the work that we do together is critically important to us because we've been in schools and we've been aware that there are things that we need to do, but there is no shame and blame. We realize that people don't always have the resources that they need to unlearn and then refine and then reconsider and then update. So how can we as authors, how can we as educators, how can we as researchers provide the evidence-based strategies and tools that our educators need to unlearn, thus being successful with implementing those equitable practices?
Mm.
Wow. Truly, this is a book that we need to get out there, and we are honored to help you champion your message. That should be our message out there with all educators across. Your book is framed under 5 critical themes, and from impact, in efficiency, learning culture, relationships. But the one that I feel like we're going down the path of is challenging growth. Can you expand a little bit more about that theme with us?
Yeah, when we think about growth and impact, we can't have growth if we don't measure our impact and if we are not willing to embrace mind frames around impact. And so, as we think about growth and our book, we know that in order to have climates that are fortifying for all, especially scholars, young people, that we have to be organizations that are willing to grow. And so, as a part of that growth, as we've talked about maybe for the last 10 minutes, that unlearning piece is so critical. And then we have to update. I'm reminded, I love quotes. And so I'm reminded of what Bruce Lee says. He says that, or said that, we have to empty our cups so that it may be filled and become devoid to gain totality. And so I love that quote from Bruce Lee. Yeah, Bruce Lee, who would have thought? But
I actually had to read.
very profound.
I was like, did she say what I think she said? Because I think Nicole is the first person ever on this podcast to actually quote Bruce Lee. I love that.
You know what? I'm well-rounded. I'm a well-rounded educator. And so, yes, I can quote some stuff. And Bruce Lee is one of them. But anyway, so, even as I think about what those words, because that's quite significant as we really think about what he said, that empty your cup so that it may be filled, become devoid to gain totality. And as we think about creating these fortifying learning communities, we have to recognize and definitely acknowledge, recognize, acknowledge, and embrace that we have new learning to do. And new learning involves growth, and put into place systems and structures and practices and policies that will be equitable for each and every scholar that walks through our door, regardless of those dimensions of identities. And so, our work is multifaceted. First, we talk about the dimensions of identities and those intersectionalities. And what we know is that dimensions of identities, you could be targeted or you could be an agent. And so when we think about targeted identities, those are the identities that are marginalized, historically marginalized. And then those that are placed as agents are those that are privileged. And all of us in these Brady Bunch squares, the 4 of us, just because of one dimension of identity, being educated and being educators, when, let's just say, COVID hit, none of us were worried about if we could go to the doctor if we were sick, because we have the means, we have insurance. And so, as Dolly Chu talks about, so I'm going to quote someone that is an educator. Dolly Chu talks about ordinary privilege, and we negate the ordinary privilege because we're focused on some of those terms and phrases that we have demonized, like white privilege. But as I think about what Dolly Chu says, we all have ordinary privilege based on the dimension of identity. And ours, just one of them, is being educated. And so as I think about this work, it is definitely growing in a multitude of areas in order to really provide those environments where all students can thrive. No one wants to say that they have been privileged. It's hard for me to even say that I have dimensions of identities that have been marginalized. But that's the reality of society. And once I can recognize, and Sonja talked about it, that personal identification of where I am and where I fit as a person and an educator in the space of disrupting inequities, I can really begin to do the work.
Yeah, you raised so many important points there, Nicole. I remember when I first started the web show for Ed Week, A Seat at the Table. My second interview was with Zaretta Hammond, and love Zaretta's work and have known her for years because she's a Corwin author. But my privilege, my bias came out within like the second question that I asked. And I remember Zaretta just looking at me saying, let's unpack what you just said. And I was like, oh no. And we still have 55 minutes to go. This is not like, um, honestly, it was really uncomfortable. It was really hard. And I had to do some soul searching to be like, within those moments of going, oh, and, but it was one of the most educational experiences that I had because I realized, and I don't even remember what the question was that I asked in the way that I asked it. There was an implicit bias that was there. And,
Mhm.
I emailed Zaretta months later and just said, I want to thank you for calling me out. And she was like, I didn't call you out. I'm like, oh, the finger came like that came up. Come on. But it was a really important part of my growth, especially when I started to interview more and more people. Now, here's the thing. I was open to it and I had the mind frame to do it. And maybe it's because we've all, been centered around John's work and we all know mind frames. Sonja, can you talk a little bit about the mind frames process? Because, you know, we know that John has mind frames. I've been a part of the leadership mind frame. I wrote, one of the chapters on feedback. So these are mind frames that you're focusing on, which I think is just so vitally important to this process. And it's kind of like, to me, for those people that are uncomfortable with the conversation, but they don't want to admit it, they can pick up the book and start to read it and they can dip their toes in it, right? And that's where the unlearning comes in too, and the reconsidering and all of that stuff. So can you explain a little bit about the mind frames and how the mind frames are meant to help people not just preach to the choir, but those people are also uncomfortable with the conversation, know it's a word, equity's been a word that's banned and everything else. This is a book that I can go to start dipping my toes in to the conversation to get better at all of this. Can you explain
Yeah.
that?
And it's that's a really good question, and actually, I'm excited to be able to be responsive because I'm really thinking about what you just asked me in relationship to what I know about people and humans, in general. And so, I want to kind of start with that whole consciousness level
Mhm.
and just who we are before we even come into this world and act. So, if you think about how you consider things out in the world before you even choose to do anything about it, you have your own private moment to really consider your own biases, your own mental models before your actions demonstrate anything differently. So when I consider the mind frames, it's an opportunity for people to self assess. And as a matter of fact, in the book, Nicole and I and Professor Hattie and Dominique have identified self awareness and reflection assessments at the beginning of every chapter because it is important for you to be conscious about what you do before you actually do it. And
Mhm.
so the mind frames gives us an opportunity to have that personal soul searching reflection around, am I engaging in ways based upon the way I'm thinking about it that will be negatively impactful to the students or anybody in this space of learning that I get an opportunity to, be with? And if so, what has these authors provided to me as a resource, as a strategy to begin to adjust my behaviors in ways where I don't engage in that way?
Mhm.
So the mind frames, Peter, give us all a chance to be thoughtful about what we do before we actually do it. So Nicole shared it at the very beginning. The impact, the way we think about the impact of what we do is more important than what we do. So I feel like the mind frames gives us choice and chances to be our best selves. It gives us an opportunity to slow down and reflect and consider, if I engage in this way, which all of our frames are affirmative and positive, but let's say if I engage in a way where I want to be respectful of diversity, what does that require me to think about first before I actually do something to demonstrate that? And so within the book, we actually give some practices and strategies for how you do that. I think the other valuable piece about these mind frames, Peter, that we have not necessarily seen specifically in the spaces of equity, belonging, and identities is the evidence and the research behind it. And so we all know that sometimes when people think about, our interpersonal skills or the way we think about things, they call it fluff. And so, as a real believer in human development and engagement, who we are interpersonally is not fluff, because it oftentimes is who we become on the outside. And so, when you think about these mind frames and the work that Professor Hattie and others, including you and Mike, have done around the research in these spaces, this is identified evidence in when we think this way, our behaviors look this way, and it impacts others in this way. So we can choose a negative road of thinking and acting and impacting others, or we can take these 10 mind frames and move in a positive direction for how will we fortify, how will we strengthen, how will we build learning communities where everybody can thrive and know their value and that they're validated in these spaces of learning. So these mind frames gives us an opportunity to be our best selves.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
You
It
know,
feels good to be a part of it too. It does.
and that's what's coming so clear in the last 20, 25 minutes is just the heart and the purpose. The two of you are so purposeful in the language that you choose to share, and it's evidence on the cover of your book when you look at, you're thinking mind frames for belonging, identities, and equity. There's a little circle on your cover that says fortifying cultural bridges.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a normal part of a cover, but it feels like there's maybe something there. Can you share a little bit about why is that put there in the cover?
Yeah. So we are, super excited about the word fortification. And what we know, from history, that fortification really comes from having a boundary against a city, a protection, if you will, that a fortified city, even, in biblical times. And in the Bible, it talks about a fortified city or a fortified wall. And so that wall provided strength, it provided protection, it provided opportunities for individuals who were damaging to a space not to come in. And so, thinking about the word fortification and fortifying practices, we thought about practices that provided an opportunity to protect the inner being of scholars, the inner being of a person. And instead of being culturally responsive or culturally sustaining, even though we want to be culturally sustaining and culturally competent, we thought that culturally fortifying is I'm really considering not only what that individual needs, but I'm also considering what they don't need. And how do we continue to strengthen who they are. And I don't know that as educators, we really think about how do I strengthen who you already are?
Mhm.
And I want to disrupt a deficit mindset of fixing and saving. I'm no one's savior. I don't need to fix anyone. However, I want to create spaces as an educator to strengthen who you already are. And so I know that there are ways of being that we can fortify or strengthen someone based on what we know about them and what we have assessed that they may need to help them thrive. Or even asking them, what is it that you need to thrive in this space? I don't want a word that I made up, assume aside. And so, I don't want to assume aside that I know what you need. Let me ask you what you need in this space. And so, culturally fortifying bridges, we wanted to pull the word or fortifying cultural bridges, that what we know is that culture is what we do and the climate is how it feels.
Mhm.
And so, and I love when Nancy Fry says that with Doug Fisher, that climate is how it feels. And so we want to create cultures that are so fortifying that they feel so good for each and every scholar that I am now positioned and I'm ready and I'm excited to learn. So that was very intentional. And we think about bridges are connections, right? Or connectors.
I love I love that. And I love, Mike, that you noticed that too. So see, that's why I love that he's my co-author and co-host.
Absolutely.
We have one last question for you. So this season is focused on the learner's mindset, but throughout the conversation, we've talked about unlearning. So Sonja, I'm going to start with you and just say, like, what did you unlearn as you were writing this book?
Mm.
I know. This is why we don't send the questions ahead of time. We want hard-hitting questions, right? No,
I
you
love it.
honestly, I haven't asked that question before. It just made me think that, we're talking about unlearning. Did you unlearn something when you were writing the book?
Yeah. One of the things that we discussed in detail, and both of you know, the joy of working with Professor Hattie. He doesn't like for me to call him Professor Hattie.
I
With
know.
John Hattie, but I have so much just honor and respect for him. Was around the term equity and knowing and understanding that, to your point, Peter, you said it at the beginning, equity has been politicized.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, too many people are losing sight of what equity means. And Nicole gave a great definition, and they're focusing on other things. And so John had this conversation with us about just the whole space of fairness. And Nicole and I had a good conversation back and forth with him around, the differences of the two. But what I unlearned, I think, in that opportunity to write with John Hattie was that the words and the way in which we say them are important.
Mhm.
So, we have to be thoughtful about the words we use, but the message that we're trying to convey is what is most important. So, if it means that we still, as you can see, have the word equity, but we help people to unpack and understand it a little bit better if we engage them around the term fairness, which it doesn't end there, then we are bringing the message forward. And so what I had to unlearn was I don't have to think about these terms and not be open to other ways to consider it so that the message can get to, the ears and hearts of people who may be closed off to it. And John just was very helpful for me and knowing, and considering ways to get that message out. So I was kind of stuck, and I'm okay with that because I think you gotta, stand for things. But I also was able to unlearn and realize that, that was that the fight I needed to, be in a space fighting. And could there be another way to get the message to people without just not including some of the thoughts and ideas that he had around fairness?
That's awesome. Nicole, what about you?
Yeah, that's really tough. And as Sonja was sharing, I was actively listening and tried to refrain from thinking about what I was going to say because I know that that is not active listening. And so, as I think about unlearning, I definitely know that we as equity champions and authors and out in the field doing the work, that there are not spaces of shame and blame that we intentionally create.
Mhm.
However, just the work might intentionally,
Mhm.
or I'm sorry, unintentionally create spaces for people to shame and blame themselves.
Mm. Mhm.
And so, even when we don't purpose to have, environments, especially learning environments of shame and blame, because that would completely go against everything that we believe around creating fortifying spaces so everyone can thrive. And so, as we work with educators, there's a recognition that people show up sometimes with their own blame and their own shame, and maybe even holding on to times when they were shamed and blamed in professional spaces and in learning spaces because of maybe not holding on or having a dimension of identity of individuals that we might be speaking of, or scholars that might be sitting in their classrooms that don't look like them. And so you just unlearning that and knowing that we have to, or I have to work incredibly hard with intention to ensure that I disrupt any feelings of shame and blame, even though I know that I haven't purposely or intentionally cast that type of atmosphere in my professional learning sessions, but just being aware. And I hope I articulated that the way I wanted it to come out. But that's just, that's been my recognition in writing this book, as we really unpacked the belonging, the identities, and equity. And one other one that I want to give that was even reinforced today as I was working with a group of principals, that in order to have equity, and I don't know that we really focused on this in the book to the degree that we could have, in order to have equity, that third dimension, you have to have spaces where individuals belong, regardless of their dimensions of identities. Because if we don't have those two pieces, we won't have equity.
Mm.
I thank you for that. And when you were talking, it made me think that, when Mike asked you the question at the beginning, when he was talking about this is hard work, I think any amount of hard work should take a lot of soul searching on
Mhm.
the learner, right? And I think your book is going to do that for people. So, Sonja and Nicole, thank you for being on
Yeah.
the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with us.
Thank you. It was a great opportunity.
Indeed, indeed, enjoyed every moment of having this conversation with the three of you. Actually, it made my day. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mike, I enjoy co-hosting with you because I feel like when Sonja was talking about co-authoring with Nicole and the kind of the fluidity and those kind of things, I feel the same way about you being my co-author, but also we just finished co-facilitating and now we have this to co-host, and I really enjoy when you ask questions because you ask questions from a very different perspective than I do, and I always learn from those. One of the things you noticed from the book was that of fortitude, and that I thought that was a fantastic question to ask them. Um, so what were your thoughts on, both with the way they answered the fortitude question, but also some of the different topics that we focused on?
They were incredibly thoughtful guests. And I know many, probably 80% of the people listening will only be listening to this podcast, but if they are actually on their computer and seeing our faces, what I noticed about them is incredibly thoughtful responses. So they looked up and into their memory of what is it that they wanted to articulate. Their eyes made those movements because they wanted to be so purposeful in the language that they use. And that goes down to the cover. And the reason that I asked that question, Peter, is you and I just wrote a book together,
Mhm.
and we know the processes of deciding on a title and what's too many words, what's not enough words, what color do you want on the cover of the book, how do you want to make it pop. All of those are very purposeful with the great marketing team at Corwin. And they have a beautiful title, Mind Frames for Belonging, Identities, and Equity. But then in this little highlighted box, almost like uh, just really putting that spotlight, they chose the words fortifying cultural bridges.
Mhm.
And when we asked that question and you watch their body language again, they both got this big smile and they sat back. And the title's important to them, but the type of response they want from readers is tied, I believe, tied to the words fortifying cultural bridges. They really want each individual to be reflective, a reflective reader, and become self-aware where they are in terms of their learning. And if they need to unlearn, they use the word unlearn, but they said really unlearning is just new learning,
Mhm.
is one of the phrases Nicole said. And I thought that was really brilliant. But I that's the reason I asked that question and what I pulled from this.
No, and I'm glad you did. I mean, I thought it was a great question to set us up very well for a deep conversation. And I really enjoy when people can offer that shared understanding of what words mean, like equity. But I thought they did a really good job of talking about unlearning and kind of creating the space around equity. And we know it's a tough conversation. We know that. I mean, it has been politicized, and we know that there are states in the country where this conversation is very difficult and people have these very visceral reactions. And when they were talking, it's why I asked them the question about, or maybe I just made the comment. I think their book can be very powerful from that way, where if I'm uncomfortable with this kind of topic, I'm going to read it on my own and take some time to really understand and do that deep soul searching. So I thought they both did such a fantastic job. I'm not surprised at all, and it's a really important book. So yeah.
Huge, just absolutely huge. They wrote it, I think, for the adults in the system. So for me as an educator, I can gain so much from this. But if you really truly listen to their podcast and you did a word dissection,
Yeah.
at the core of every answer that they gave was mostly the word scholar, but sometimes the word student. There's
Yeah.
synonyms, obviously,
Yeah.
is the core of everything that they're doing and what they're trying to articulate. And how can the adults in the system um, work in such a way to support scholars or students around belonging, and identities and equity. They're big three.
Well, this conversation, just like most from this season, has been the reason why I love doing the podcast, because I feel like we can kind of sit down, ask questions, and learn and unlearn at the same time. So for everybody listening, thank you very much for your time, and we're hoping that you can give us feedback. We often get feedback when we're on the road, and we get emails from people. Please keep those coming because they're really important for us. And if you have guests that you think we should be interviewing, you can certainly contact us about those, because those are people that we actually find and interview as well. But Mike, until next time, it's great co-hosting with you.
And you as well, Peter. Thank you.